All right, so I'm going to be talking about cover crop grazing management today. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a soil scientist at Auburn, and I'm not an animal scientist, but I am part of a large group that's working on different strategies for cover crop grazing management that includes an interdisciplinary team at Auburn. So I think as soil scientists, we can get almost into a philosophical discussion about whether to call winter grazing a cover crop and when we can call it a cover crop. But as many of our speakers previously today have said, I think it really comes down to how you're managing that cover to achieve the goals that you're working towards. And so as a winter cover crop, or as winter grazing, typically as long as we're managing well and not overgrazing, we're going to at least achieve some level against erosion protection and prevention of nutrient loss, because we do at least have some level of cover out there on the soil. But as we've heard from so many of our speakers today, especially Dr. Culpepper just talking about biomass, and with Mike talking about moisture retention, biomass is really key to a lot of the different goals that we're trying to achieve with cover crops. And so there is some kind of happy medium in there with grazed cover crops where we don't necessarily manage it the more conventional way and graze it down to the very ground in order to terminate it, but still get some forage, high quality forage value out of a cover, and then achieve some grow back to provide some biomass that can help work towards conserving soil moisture, improving organic matter, and those types of things. So I'm going to go a few different topics today and just share with you some considerations that we may have for grazing cover crop systems that we wouldn't have for a traditional cover crop system. So starting with cover crop selection, then management of that cover, termination, and planting into cover crop residue. And then I'm going to end with a video that was made by one of my graduate students on some of the current research that we're doing related to cover crop grazing. And so the first thing that I'd like to discuss is cover crop selection. One of the factors that we have to consider with a grazed cover crop as opposed to a traditional cover crop is the intake needs of cattle and the nutritive value that a cover would provide to cattle when it needs it most. And so I've shared here, this is taken from the Southern Forages book that Joel Love mentioned earlier today. It's a great book for looking into the forage quality of different covers and when they might be useful. So there's some additional considerations when we're grazing the cover, like that forage quality. So for example, when it comes to small grains, we know that with oats, we have a little bit higher level of forage quality in terms of crude protein and total digestible nutrients compared to some of our other small grain crops like rye and wheat. However, oats are also more sensitive to frost in these covers. So it's kind of a balancing act with getting the right level of dry matter produced as well as the forage quality. And there may also be some considerations in terms of just the health toxins that could be produced, like hairy vetch, as it matures, can produce some toxins, so its intake needs to be limited. Radishes and some of our other brassicas are very low in fiber, so they shouldn't make up, I've seen anywhere between 50 to 75% of a cattle's diet. And also with the daikon radishes, they can take some additional time for cows to get used to eating. So they may, if they're grown as part of a mixture, they may prefer some of the other covers that are included before those cattle will eat the radishes. So another consideration with the cover crop selection would be just the timing of when that is going to be available, that biomass is going to be available. And this is largely dependent on the species, but also the varieties. As Julia talked about a good bit earlier today, we have wide ranges in variety with a lot of our, in maturity with many of our varieties of small grains. So what I'm showing on this screen is the species composition for Florida 401 rye and Cossack oats or grasses, AU Sunrise Crimson Clover, and a T-Raptor brassica that was planted in mid-October in South Alabama last year. And we're looking at how the percentage of our mix changes over time, that species composition, when we started grazing in mid-January all through early April when we planted cotton, or right before termination. So we can see that with our grasses that we had grown here, we targeted the early mature Florida 401 rye, the Cossack oat. That was really dominating the mixture early in the grazing season. And then our brassicas were also providing some significant growth early in the season, whereas our clovers were providing more growth as we got further into the spring season. So this is another consideration for producers, in addition to that forage quality, is when those forages are going to be available. Another issue that we may not think about when it comes to selection, well, we should think about it always, but checking herbicide labels prior to deciding the cover crop species based on planting or grazing restrictions. And so I provided an example of some research that was done by Dr. Steve Lee's group in Auburn looking at residual herbicide carryover and its effects on different cover crops. So as in this example, we had if we had carryover of herbicides like dual magnum, zidua, and warrant, these group 15 herbicides reduced stands and biomass early on in the growing season, 50 days after planting, but we didn't see differences in biomass at the end of cover crop planting. So in a traditional cover crop system, we may not be as worried about this, but it is something to consider in a grazing system as we are working to achieve high biomass early on in the growing season, not just when we terminate prior to that cash crop planting. And so this is more of a concern if we're on a finer textured soil type, or if we've had multiple applications of these types of herbicides. I know another example would be cadre prior to planting of brassica cover crops, that sometimes we can see an effect on plant stands there. But this is just something else to be aware of when selecting cover crops based on your cash crop rotation system. And another thing I would like to point out too, and I know that there were a couple that said this earlier on, I think it was Joel that said do no harm. So again, in grazing systems as well, being sure that you choose a cover crop to plant within that cash crop that's not going to cause any harm. So I know some of our research in Alabama recently, we've seen up to a 1,000 pound per acre yield penalty in peanut when we plant that peanut following a crimson clover cover crop, even when it's included in a two species mixture. So again, just something else to consider as you're selecting. Cover crop management, we have a different level of management that's expected when we're growing a cover crop for grazing. We do want to make sure that our pH, phosphorus, and potassium are adequate according to soil test recommendations, which typically they should be, as long as we're maintaining those nutrients for our cash crops that are in rotation. And for nitrogen, this is really where we're going to have some differences. And I have this graph that Kip showed earlier in the day that this depends on our needs for cattle, but for maximum production of our small grains, you know, we're going to apply up to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And of course, getting that cover in earlier is going to help us get higher levels of biomass as well. We're going to want to skew towards a lower nitrogen rate if we plant early, because again, we can achieve the same level of biomass with less nitrogen if we plant early, like Kip pointed out earlier today. Also, if a legume like peanut or soybean was just harvested, we can see sometimes some benefit in terms of nitrogen. I know Mike Mulvaney's done some research showing that those benefits may be less than we think, but sometimes we can get a slight nitrogen benefit from following those legume cash crops. And then also if less than maximum production is desired. Then in the spring or late winter, we're going to want to apply additional nitrogen up to about 60 pounds to maximize that production, unless we're in a grass legume mixture. If we have a good stand of legumes and it's making up about 30 to 50%, our recommendation is not to apply any additional nitrogen. And of course, as with any cover crop system, it's important to inoculate those legume seed to promote nitrogen fixation. So moving on further into cover crop management for grazing, our goal when we're thinking of winter forage production systems as a cover crop to provide some benefit to the soil, some of the practices that we can use to achieve goals to benefit the soil would be to use improved grazing strategies like rotational grazing, always prevent overgrazing, remove cattle when fields are saturated, as this can significantly lead to compaction issues, and then also allow adequate grow back time to maximize the benefits to the following cash crop. So, as I mentioned, using improved grazing strategies like rotational grazing will help us to provide achieve a higher level of improved soil properties. So, for example, rotational grazing would be a system in which we divide fields into paddocks, which we rotate, and we place cattle and intensively graze down the cover crop for a short period of time and then move them onto the next paddock. And this allows us to increase our stocking rate as compared to what we would do in a continuously grazed system. So it requires a higher level of management and labor because it requires installation of temporary fencing and moving cattle pretty continuously, but it does allow us to increase the number of cattle that we can use on a given acreage of land and still help to promote those improved soil properties. Of course, we always want to prevent overgrazing. These are some different suggested grazing heights for beginning grazing on some different common cover crops like rye, oat, wheat, and triticale. We would want to start grazing when we're at about 8 to 12 inches and stop grazing when we get down to about 3 to 4 inches. And if we graze further than that, we can really damage our root system, and that will prevent further growth of that cover crop on into the growing season. You'll notice I didn't include ryegrass, and it was for those same reasons that Stanley mentioned, that it's an excellent forage. It's excellent in terms of forage quality, but it can cause issues as a weed if we're not careful. So I'm not going to go into information on choosing stocking rates depending on your system, but there's a lot of information on that available with your various extension systems and through your various extension specialists in the animal sciences. And we also, I'd like to point out, we have a lot of information on southerncovercrops.org, the website of the Southern Cover Crop Council, which I know Julia's already mentioned, but even within specifically for grazing, we've got some excellent information on which different cover crops are going to be best for your system and what concerns you may have for a specific cover and manage that. So when we use those improved grazing management strategies, we know that we can use that to reduce the effects of grazing on compaction. There's been plenty of research to show that. And then also we can help to distribute nutrients evenly across the field. So I used this example graph that I have for Bermuda grass, but the same principle applies for any of the annual crops that we're using as a cover. So when we remove a grass from the system, we're removing a lot of nutrients, and cattle are going to recycle those back to the soil. So for example, with Bermuda grass, let's see how much this is for. So this is for 8 tons of Bermuda grass. We would remove about 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And in a pasture, we would recycle the vast majority of that and only take off about 13 pounds per acre in those cattle. But if we're in a system with continuous grazing that is not very intensively managed, that distribution of nutrients that are recycled back onto the soil may not be as even. So in order to evenly distribute those nutrients around the field, using those improved grazing management strategies can help us achieve that. And then lastly, allowing adequate grow back time to maximize benefits to the following cash crop. And this is where we've been doing some research in Alabama, is looking at winter grazing systems in a cotton peanut rotation in which we're planting cover crops in mid-October. We're beginning cattle grazing in mid-January and have different cattle removal dates, and looking at the effect that that has on production as well as soil dynamic properties as well. So of course, as we increase our grazing season length, we're going to reduce the amount of biomass that's available that will decompose as residue for the following cash crop to lay on top of that surface. So this is an example of our different timings of grazing, where we had a control without grazing, in mid-February removal, where we had about 1 month of grazing. We saw biomass reduced from about 7,000 pounds per acre to about 4,000 pounds of biomass per acre. And then as we move on to our mid-March and mid-April cattle removal dates, we only had about 2,000 pounds of biomass left on the soil surface. And so, like we talked about again with those different benefits that we may be trying to achieve, whether it be weed suppression or moisture retention, having that additional biomass is going to be key. So if we're working towards that, 3 months of grazing may not be ideal for having enough residue to provide some of those benefits. So cover crop termination, in a more traditional system, again, we would probably heavily graze a cover crop in order to terminate, but this leaves minimal residue on the soil surface. And so again, coming back to what benefits are we trying to achieve, we want to allow some time to regrow and then terminate chemically in order to really maximize that biomass that's left out there. So for some resources on appropriate herbicides for terminating specific cover crops, again, I'm going to point you to the southerncovercrops.org website. All right, moving on to planting into the cover crop residue. A huge concern in grazing systems is going to be the increased risk of soil compaction in our row crop production systems. And we've seen through decades of research in the Southeast, back with Wayne Bree's group in the 90s and early 2000s, and Kip, I know, has had some research more recently on this. We've seen improved cash crop yields and profitability when we use a deep non-inversion tillage following grazing compared to a no-till system. And so we've seen this with corn, with cotton, with peanut. And so this is highly recommended by us when transitioning into a system in which you're going to graze a winter cover crop and then plant, that there needs to be some kind of deep tillage to break up soil compaction layers, but not disturb the soil surface and allow residue to remain on the soil surface to provide various benefits. This is some compaction data from our research that I mentioned, looking at those different cattle removal dates where we have different levels of compaction. In this study, we've been using a subsoil roller and strip tillage prior to planting of our cash crop in order to break up compaction layers. And we've taken penetrometer readings with Kip's group, looking at compaction in the cotton, in this case, or peanut row, and then in an untrafficked row, in the trafficked row, and then halfway in between each. So we're actually collecting penetrometer measurements at 5 different locations, distances from the row middle, as well as at different depths. And you can see that when we run this subsoil roller, you can see where that shank has run through the field, and we don't see any differences in compaction down to about 16 inches in the soil when we use that subsoil roller. We do see some, in this case, that at these deeper depths of about 40 to 50 centimeters in our treatments that had very long grazing periods, some increased compaction, and this could be due to, that increased traffic, but also could just be the effect of moisture. We don't have a lot of residue left out on the surface in these treatments, and so as Mike showed earlier, that's going to affect our moisture storage, and penetration resistance is heavily impacted by those, by the moisture at the time of sampling. So I'm going to stop my presentation, and because my graduate student, Haley Crowell, she made a really excellent video on some of our current research and does a really excellent job of explaining what we're doing right now. Let me just share this.
At Auburn University, we have some exciting research to share with y'all. Here's a quick breakdown of our project titled Impacts of Winter Grazing on Soil Health in Southeastern Cropping Systems. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. First, I want to address the few major questions. What, why, and how? Beginning with what? What do I mean by winter grazing? Well, I mean the utilization of an integrated crop livestock system. And what is an integrated crop livestock system? Simply put, it's a system that combines row crop production with animal husbandry. In this study's case, it adds a period of grazing on a winter cover crop mixture between the growth of our cash crops, which are rotated between cotton and peanut each year. Now that I've addressed the what, why are we investigating integrated crop livestock systems in the Southeast? It really comes down to two things: money, which is important to producers and, well, everyone, and soil health in the Southeast. Let's take a closer look at money. Not only does winter grazing provide economic benefits because producers can use their land year-round, but this also provides winter feed, which is a major expense to producers. On top of that, many producers in the Southeast already have livestock, so the opportunity to merge these systems is there. That being said, more research is needed on how to best manage this type of integrated crop livestock system in the Southeast for producers to feel confident to implement it. And this brings us to soil health. While economic benefits are important, we have to make sure they don't outweigh the impact on the environment. Ideally, we'd want to improve soil health through implementing this type of system. Let's travel back in time. Soils in the Southeast have been historically degraded as a result of practices like intensive tillage, monocropping, and insufficient added residues. On top of the extensive use of the soil, the combination of the warm, humid climate in the Southeast with the ulti-soft soil type here, which is known to be highly weathered and carbon depleted, the soils in the Southeast are lower in soil organic matter than other regions. And why do we care about soil organic matter? Well, soil organic matter is kind of like the king of soil health indicators. There are chemical, physical, and biological indicators of soil health, but soil organic matter is considered the most important because it's so closely linked to many other properties. For example, soil organic matter can enhance nutrient cycling, chemical, improve soil structure, physical, and sustain microbial activity, biological. So we want producers to be able to sustainably make money. And finding the best management practice for an integrated crop livestock system in the Southeast is what will enable us to do that. It's already well understood and documented that conservation tillage, crop rotations, and cover crops are beneficial to soil health. But what about integrated crop livestock systems? How will they impact soil health in the Southeast, and how can producers best manage this type of system to optimize soil health? Which brings us to our two objectives. One, to determine the effects grazing livestock have on soil health when used in a southeastern cropping system, and two, to determine the ideal length of winter grazing that optimizes soil health in a southeastern cropping system. And this brings us to how. How did we investigate this? Well, down at the Wiregrass Research and Extension Center in Headland, Alabama, a field study was set up, and it looks a little like this. Livestock were put out onto a field to graze a winter cover crop mixture in early January. 12 1.2 hectare paddocks were set up with 1 of 4 treatments in each paddock. The 4 treatments were an ungrazed control, a mid-February cattle removal date, a mid-March cattle removal date, and a mid-April cattle removal date. These treatments help us identify how long livestock can graze while still optimizing soil health. All of these treatments were replicated 3 times in a randomized complete block design. The winter cover crop mixture contained rye, oat, crimson clover, and Nebraska hybrid. And in each paddock, we collected soil health data. As mentioned before, soil health can be measured through many methods, and many soil health indicators interact in a variety of ways. We chose 2 chemical, 2 physical, and 2 biological indicators of soil health. Our chemical indicators, soil organic carbon and permanganate oxidizable carbon, aka active carbon, are directly linked to soil organic matter, and they help us quantify soil health. Our physical indicators, penetration resistance, and water-stable aggregates show us how the trampling and grazing of the livestock and the livestock's consumption of the cover crop mixture impact water, air, and nutrient movement throughout the soil. Our biological indicators, microbial biomass carbon and our vascular mycorrhizal fungi, help us understand how the grazing times impact microbial communities, which is directly linked to soil organic matter and soil health. These soil health indicators were selected for qualities like short-term sensitivity, measurement repeatability, and usefulness. We want these indicators to help us predict how changes in management are impacting the soil health. Over the last 2 years, our data has shown some differences in cover crop biomass and microbial biomass carbon between treatment. We have also seen a difference in cotton lint yield in 2019 between treatments. Starting with the biomass. As you can see, and as you would imagine, with increasing time livestock are able to graze, there is less biomass present on the soil, with the control having the greatest since no grazing occurred there, and the mid-April cattle removal date having the least since the livestock were allowed to graze for the longest time there. Microbial biomass carbon was the greatest in the control plots where no grazing occurred, which can possibly be attributed to the greater residues left behind, as crop residues serve as food for microbial life. In 2019, we saw a significant difference in cotton lint yield between treatments, which could possibly be linked to the amount of moisture that was retained in the soil from the greater residues present on the surface in the control and mid-February cattle removal plots. We will continue collecting and evaluating data for the next few years. More time under this management may be needed to see greater changes between treatments, and we are so excited to see what we can learn about managing an integrated crop livestock system in the Southeast, especially if it can help growers become more profitable while improving soil health. A big thank you to Auburn University's Department of Crop, Soil, and Environmental Sciences, the USDA Alabama NRCS, and NEPA for funding this research.
Okay, get back to my other screen. So again, just to reiterate what some of Haley had said on this research that we've had, we've tried to differentiate from some of the previous research, looking at winter grazing in cash crop rotations by looking at some of the microbial aspects of soil health, which I know people are very interested in right now. So we haven't seen a lot of differences in these properties after 2 years, but we're going to continue to evaluate that over time. We haven't seen negative impacts of grazing on compaction or aggregate stability within the soils, and we have seen some differences in our first year. When we looked at cotton yields, we saw about a 200 pound per acre difference in lint yield when we had those ungrazed and early cattle removal dates, just again probably due to that increased moisture retention with that higher residue that's out there. And so again, just want to end by saying, you know, having a grazed cover crop, there's a lot of different decisions to be made, and it really depends on what your goals are. If anyone has any questions, this is my contact information, and I'll leave it there.